to a room full of masked people here. And good morning to all of you. It's good to see you all, especially the students over there. It's so nice to see you. Wish we had even more time so I could get all your names and learn a little bit about each one of you. But I am at Franklin and Marshall College, as you probably know, and that is where Noah was a student preceding me, myself. And I guess I have to say, got it. Are you doing that? You see it up there?
Oh, yeah. So just need to
get down there and say, got it. All right. So as mentioned just now, Noel published his first paper on boulder fields in Pennsylvania. And boulder fields are fascinating. First, they look spectacular, amazing. They're provocative, they're curious, enigmatic, and how could something like it even be created? But what's also interesting about them is that worldwide they had been observed. They had been observed in the Falkland Islands, for example, in the Southern Hemisphere. They had been observed throughout Europe and in other parts of the world, and people always wondered about them. So they're one of the very first things that geologists and other scientists began to notice that they couldn't quite explain. So there's a long history of this, and I described that history in detail in a new paper coming out in May, which is a review of what's known about periglacial landscapes in the eastern US. By periglacial, what we mean is features that were produced during cold, very cold conditions when frost action was intense. It doesn't mean necessarily that it was near glacial, which is what you think peri must mean. Periglacial means near glacial. And for sure, many of these features were probably near glacial when they were actively forming, but not all. So today, the modern sense of periglacial is they were associated with, either were or are associated with very cold conditions, lots of frost action, maybe permafrost, but that's not essential. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we now know that permafrost did exist in this landscape, but we did not know that until recently. And the reason is boulder fields, which we would think surely they're somehow associated with permafrost, but permafrost, if they're not diagnostic of permafrost, permafrost is when the ground is frozen for at least 2 years and does not thaw completely over a 2-year period. So it persists over time. And going into very cold conditions like full glacial times, it's cold enough in some places for the ground to remain frozen for at least 2 years. And then it comes out of that during the warm periods, like today, we're in a warm period, but some parts of the earth still have permafrost, like parts of Siberia, Antarctica, the Alaskan region. But there used to be permafrost here, where we find all these boulder fields. However, many have said to us who work on these things, for decades they have said, just the fact you have boulder fields doesn't mean you had permafrost. Sure, you had frost action, but you don't. But frost action just means it's cold, cold enough to have a lot of frost action, not necessarily cold enough to have frozen ground. You might think, well, why does that matter? Does it matter if there was permafrost here? But thinking about permafrost in the world today, we realize that it's very different. When you get to a place that's frozen all year long, except for the topmost part that thaws in the summer, that part of the earth behaves very differently. And when it thaws, it behaves very differently. When that ground thaws, there can be the degradation of permafrost leading to all sorts of mass movement and settlement and what we call thermokarst. And those landslides that are moving off hill slopes can block streams. And so we see that happening throughout the Arctic region today. Probably Ben has seen quite a bit of it. When you fly over Arctic landscapes and you look at the permafrost thaw that's occurring, you see a lot of mass movement. A lot of thermokarst features are like sinkholes. So here in Pennsylvania and other adjacent states, we'd seen these boulder fields. We wondered if maybe they were associated with permafrost. Now, if you just think about how you even get a boulder field, and the things are so curious about it. First, it's made of boulders, right? And a lot of them, how do you even make that many boulders, right? Out of the bedrock outcrops nearby? Probably frost cracking and a lot of it. But then they move away from their source. They have to move somehow and get down slope. And in this case, Hickory Run boulder field in Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, it's a very low gradient hill slope, very low, like 1 degree or 2 degrees. So how do boulders even move across a nearly planar surface, nearly level surface? But they did. Well, we thought if we knew the ages of them, if we knew when they were exposed and how long they've been sitting there, maybe we could then know something about their origin in more detail. So maybe we find out the age might be the same as last full glacial, which is about 18 to 25,000 years ago. That was the last time it was really cold on Earth. Although it's been cold repeatedly for a couple million years, it was really cold, and a big ice sheet had extended down from the Arctic region, the northern polar region, down into what's now Pennsylvania. So we thought if we know the age of this, we'll know then maybe that it was associated with that last glacial maximum, perhaps. So some students from University of Vermont, Alison Dem was the lead work on this, her master's project, and the other people were involved. I don't know if Jordan was involved in that at all, but one of your professors here was working with some of those folks at Penn State at times. But they determined, based on the accumulation of isotopes on the surfaces of the boulders that are produced from cosmic ray flux. You might have learned about cosmogenic isotopes in this class, cosmic ray flux. They determined that these boulders have been exposed for somewhere between 50 and 700,000 years. So what does that tell us? If you think about it, like, what do we know then? Now we know the age, finally. And they sampled a lot of boulders and got the cosmogenic isotope concentrations on many boulders. And from that determined, these boulders have been exposed that long. So it tells us they've been exposed a long time. This feature is old. It doesn't necessarily tell us it was associated only with cold forming conditions, cold periglacial conditions. Although it doesn't appear to be actively doing anything today. So that's one perplexing issue about these. I'm going to tell you how we've been trying to date things to figure out things like this, to figure out if indeed they are associated with the last glacial maximum and if there might have been permafrost. Those are my two goals. Can we find things that are similar, that are definitely as recently formed as 18,000 years ago, 18 to 25? That's first. And then secondly, can we conclude they must have been associated with permafrost? If we can determine there was permafrost, we know the paleotemperatures. Because permafrost, continuous permafrost, only exists where the mean annual temperatures are between or below about -4 degrees Celsius on average throughout the year, mean annual temperature. So if we knew this was associated with permafrost, we then know the paleotemperature. If we knew when it formed, we would know the paleotemperature at that time. So that's where I'm going with all this. Can I go down? I guess go over here. So I'll go up here and there we go. Okay, so the second thing that's very perplexing is that I began noticing while studying streams in the region, and here's an example from Maryland, but we saw this in many places, began noticing that there were boulders in the valley bottoms. So I'm down here near the valley bottom of today it's a small stream, and you can see the boulders down there, and they're angular, and they're all sizes. Some of them are actually quite large. There are some boulders upslope there and it's in the stream bank that are as big as those at Hickory Run Boulder Field. And over top of them, there's a dark soil, and it's a wetland soil. And in places that was very thick and we radiocarbon dated it, the bottom of it was about 13,000 years old. So we know that about 13,000 years ago, the stuff below that was done moving, however it had moved. And then a wetland soil, we know wetland because we have the plant types in it from the seeds, the fossil seeds. So we know that about 13,000 years ago, there was a wetland forming on top of those boulders. So I thought right away, these are kind of like the boulders we see on bouldery slopes all over the region. But meanwhile, other geomorphologists were telling me, no, that's the old river. That's the river that was there before someone built some dam nearby that we had figured out had been built and buried the whole thing with mill pond mud. And that black soil is the old floodplain from that river meandering around. And that was kind of the common conventional way of thinking about these things. I didn't put in here a slide I'd love to show, and I wish I had thought to do it, but I'll explain it to you. There's this famous painting, kind of a Middle Ages type painting by Hans the Elder, Hans something the Elder. And you see these merchants standing there in their gorgeous velvet robes and hats. And then down the floor, there's some weird object. And if you walk to the side of the painting and look from along it at a 90-degree angle, that weird object's actually a skull. And it's referred to in art as anamorphosis, where you see something, and if you're looking straight onto it at that perspective, you can't quite tell what it is, but if you change your perspective, you can tell what it is. So I like to refer to that when I show this slide and say, we look at that and we think that everything in the outcrop is probably fluvial because we're in a stream. But the stream only formed in the last few decades after some mill dam breached and the stream cut down and exposed some reservoir sediment overlying a former wetland, overlying a former hill slope. So if you think of a valley, I usually use things when I'm lecturing like to bend. This doesn't bend probably. Any paper in here? If you think of a valley shaped like this U shape, and down there is stuff moving into down slope like a hickory run, things moving down the slopes over time during cold times, and they accumulate in the valley, and then that all ends, it gets warm, there's a wetland forming down there, and then somebody comes along and builds a dam circa 1750 AD, and the valley fills with sediment, and then the dam breaches over here, the stream cuts down, and now we have this little gully, this little ravine cut into the mill pond sediment, the wetland soil, and the frost cracked material that I will later explain, Jello Flexion. So I refer to anamorphosis here because if we stop thinking about it being all the result of some stream and recognize the stream is a young thing that just formed recently, it's a gully, basically a ditch. I could have dug it with a backhoe, right? I could have made that thing. That thing has nothing to do with all the deposits. As my friend Bill Dietrich said, ergo nothing is fluvial here. Mill pond mud is not from the stream, the wetland soil is not, and this bouldery stuff under it is not. So it's taken me a while to convince many people that the stuff that we're seeing under the historic sediment, which I refer to as a result of a Pompeii effect, where the valley bottoms were blanketed, just blanketed in sediment in many, many places. There were so many dams. And under the wetland soil, if we just keep thinking about what's down there, we begin to realize what's down there is this shattered bedrock, highly shattered. And that shattered material flowed down slope during permafrost thaw. So I came to realize that years ago, but I didn't have any conclusive evidence there had been permafrost. And meanwhile, others who were dating things like the Hickory Run boulder field couldn't even conclude exactly when it happened, other than between 50 and 700,000 years ago. So I kind of went on this mission to date the stuff under there and to show that it probably was associated with permafrost. So now I'll get into that. Right, so I began to recognize the way to get boulders in valley bottoms is by solifluction, and a type of solifluction, a subset of that is called Jello Flexion. So solifluction just in general means earth material flows down slope because it has very low shear strength and it's very weak. So it can flow if it gets really wet. So an earth flow could be associated with solifluction. But it's very common where there's permafrost because the ground is frozen on average more than 2 years. In fact, maybe for hundreds or thousands of years, it's been frozen. It might be frozen down 1,000 meters in really cold cases. The topmost part can thaw during the summer, especially during the really warm summers, and especially when permafrost thaw is occurring regionally over a long time, like during periods of modern global, like today, modern global warming. And what happens is that topmost part is called the active layer, and it's thawing in the summer. And as it thaws, any moisture in it is melting, any ice is melting, and that cannot infiltrate because the ground below is frozen. So it becomes really goopy, soupy, it's very low shear strength, very weak, and it flows easily, even if it contains boulders. So this view here of a place in Alaska is showing shattered rock from upslope moving down as part of the active layer thaw each summer. And if these are thick plug-like flows that are kind of moving it as one large mass, one large plug, we call it Jello Flexion. The profile with depth is a little different for Jello Flexion. So I began to realize that much of what I was seeing on the hillsides and in the valley bottoms was the result of Jello Flexion and or Flexion. And there's a story I love to tell, and I wonder if Noel remembers it. But long ago, before we had LiDAR, I was standing on a hill slope, I think maybe in South Mountain, and pointing out to people that I saw these lobes. And a lot of folks on that trip argued with me and said they didn't agree with me. And I kept saying, no, no, I see lobes all over the hill slopes. And I was trying to survey them with a tow station in the forest. It was nearly impossible. I think you met us, Noel. And at one of those trips with a bunch of people, someone was saying they didn't agree with me. And then they said, what do you think, Bob? And Bob Walter, a geologist, is my husband. And he said, well, she's right. I believe her. And then someone else laughed and yelled at, but you always agree with her. And he said, of course, happy wife, happy life, right? But then we got LiDAR. And as soon as we had the LiDAR, we could see these features. And I'll show that in a little bit. They're very clear. Even where it's forested, with the LiDAR, you can remove the vegetation. So these weren't just here and there in a few places, they're widespread in this landscape. So I began to think they're widespread, the stuff that I see in the valley bottoms, the colluvium, we call it colluvium, it's hill slope material. It's so widespread in the valley bottoms in this region. On the hill slopes, these lobes are so widespread. Surely there's something to do with active layer thaw. And yet again, when I talk to the permafrost people around the world, they'd say, you don't have diagnostic evidence of permafrost. Solid fluctuation can occur without permafrost. So I began to wonder, well, what do we need to prove there was permafrost then, conclusively? Now, here's a modern view from Norway where there is permafrost. And when there's thaw of that active layer, these lobes of shattered material move down slope. So you can see why they're lobe shaped. They're flowing, and as they're flowing, they come down slope to a lower gradient area. And even though they're low strength and they're weak, as they move into a place of a lower slope, they're no longer able to move. So they slow down and stop. And they have fairly sharp frontal snouts. You can see people down there, whom I think Noel and Helen's son worked with for a while. So, Uli. So we know what these things look like in 3D. We know about the stratigraphy of them. They're what's called matrix supported, meaning that as they flow, there's a matrix of finer material and the coarser material is embedded in that and going along for the ride. It's buoyant. And we know where, these are things we know them. We know how they form today. We know though that they can also be found where there's not continuous permafrost. We know going back about 20,000 years ago or so, where the Laurentide ice sheet ended. And it ended, as you can see there, find my cursor, just north of us here in northern Pennsylvania. And you can trace that on out then to the eastern shore. And at that time, sea level would have been lower. We know from a lot of paleoclimate data, it was really cold. So it's not a stretch to say, well, maybe there was permafrost here then, right near that ice margin. We know it was really cold from pollen data, for example, at that time. And we know there was this ice sheet that was about a mile thick, they say. We now know from Jill Marshall's work, this is her work on the left, and we're collaborating with her and we're publishing a paper with her where we use her frost cracking data. She took data from climate models showing what the climate was like roughly 20,000 years ago, last full glacial maximum. And using that, she was able to show in the bottom left how much frost cracking there might have been. And when the rocks are cracked, cracking occurs in cold regions because the rock is in two ways. One way is that ice can form in the planes of weakness along fractures and pore spaces. So any pore space, bedding planes, joints, faults, etc., can accumulate ice. It's called segregation ice. And segregation ice serves to shatter bedrock and other sediments too as well. And another way that cracking occurs is when the ground's contracting, and so if the bedrock, for example, is contracting, and it begins to get these big cracks that are like polygonal mud cracks almost, and I'll show some of those later. But she's modeling how much cracking would occur associated with that segregation ice, and how much porosity would be increased in the rock as a result of the cold conditions during last glacial maximum, that's bottom left. And what it's showing then is over some depth integrating it, there's a big increase in porosity. So just telling us the rock shattered. And the top, that's the modern extent of frost shattering. You can see it is cold enough to get maybe a little bit. We get something called deep seasonal frost in places. But so there's Pennsylvania north of DC. But during last glacial maximum, it was much, much more frost cracking. She's also shown on there this last glacial maximum permafrost, this white line, and it's not as extensive. You can see the big tongue there over the Appalachian Mountains. So the Appalachian Mountains are higher, so more frost cracking and more permafrost. But notice then that there are many places here with no permafrost that would have had frost cracking and might even have had some solifluction. On the upper right is a diagram based on some older maps by Troy Payway in the 1980s, and then even more recent versions of that by Hugh French and a woman he worked with. I forget her first name, something Millar's her last name. But they simply redrew some older, they compiled older data about what we know about where there are solifluction lobes and deposits. Although in the early days, we mostly knew about the deposits, not so much the lobes till we had LIDAR. But notice here it says ice wedges. This is really key at this point. Well, let me before I get to ice wedges, look at the solifluction of circles. Notice they show these going way down into the southern Appalachians. And they show them up here near the ice margin in the north. What's interesting is now that we have LIDAR, we could basically make that solid dots. You could show solifluction almost everywhere in there. And we could show solifluction lobes to the east and to the west in a very thick band. But back then, this earlier work was based on outcrops. People saw these things in the outcrop and they associated with solifluction. So they referred to it as colluvium from solifluction. Now let's go to these little black triangles and the white triangles. The black ones say ice wedge pseudomorphs or sand wedge casts of LGM age. The one below that says ice wedge pseudomorphs younger than LGM. Those younger ones, are only up to the north of the ice sheet margin. So as the ice sheet retreated during during warming in the Holocene, the last 11,700 years, and prior to that, so the warming began let's say 17,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat, the edge of it retreated, and ground was uncovered that then got ice wedge casts. You probably don't know necessarily what ice wedges are, but they're important because they are diagnostic of permafrost. And they are places where the ground cracked from cold conditions, like a giant mud crack. And sometimes some of these were about half the size of this room. And the ground cracks, so it's vertical cracks. And in those cracks, water can accumulate and freeze. And gradually it makes these wedge shapes that taper with depth. They go all the way around the polygons. You can imagine a wedge of ice all the way around us here in this room, if this was a giant ice wedge polygon. We call them thermal contraction polygons. It's from thermal contraction. If there's very little moisture in the environment, like a desert landscape, Antarctica is in places, desert cold conditions, sand can get in there, windblown sand. It gets in those cracks and it makes sand wedges. And that's why it says sand wedge cast. So somebody has found out in the Midwest relict features of these ice wedge pseudomorphs. And they are considered diagnostic of permafrost because we only find them today actively forming where there's permafrost. It has to be that cold to get the ground to get cold enough to crack and make these polygonal cracks. So I'm going to show you some of these in a moment because I began to think, so here's my reasoning, which I think is really important for people to know that this is what happened. I was seeing solifluction in every valley bottom I worked in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and a few other adjacent states. I was seeing solifluction on the hillsides, the lobe shapes, the colluvium. We found it with the LIDAR. And yet we couldn't conclusively say there was permafrost. So I began to realize if we can find thermal contraction polygons and sand wedges and or ice wedge casts, ice wedge pseudomorphs or sand wedge casts, then we can say we had permafrost. But notice none of those are mapped in there. Nobody had found them yet. Turns out some few people did find things like that. It was in field guides and a few publications. It's not shown here in the maps. It wasn't, and they hadn't been dated. So I began looking for them. So let me go to Google Earth. So I have to do a new screen share to do this. So where does it say new share? Do I have to stop share to get
Yeah.
Go to the green new share.
green? Oh, thank you. Thank you. So new share, we're going to go to Google Earth. So in 2014, a paper came out by George Gow. And George Gow is a Canadian geologist. Oops, I got back over there. Let's see if I can do this again.
You're
Still there, good. I can just go back and forth then even, great. So George Gow began using Google Earth imagery to see if he could find thermal contraction polygons in the Eastern US. And his paper came out in December of that year, and we know some people who know him well. So I'm going to zoom into his layer here, and he made a Google Earth layer of his work. We find it in this teeny writing over here. Where is it? Somewhere in there it says coastal plain. If anybody sees it before me, let me know. Should be near the top. Let's see. Where is it? Here it is. Okay. So we learned about George Gow's work. He made these yellow drop pins, and he published a paper and he released the drop pins. He said every one of these is a thermal contraction polygon or a field of thermal contraction polygons. So we're going to go to just one randomly, all right? So we'll go to this one. They're all pretty good. We'll go in there, and what he found is he had to use certain months of the year air photos to see these things. Yeah, so there they are. You can imagine him sitting somewhere with Google Earth, and I met with him. He came down to visit, and we showed him some of our sites. And he said, yeah, I can see them in this, it's an August view of 2008. And the ground's cracked, and it's actually, these cracks are filled with sand. And other people have found a few of these in quarries and actually dated them. Look at that, another time of the year, you can't see it. There you can, but then there you can't. So once we saw his paper and then we communicate with him about it, we realized we can probably find these. We just have to use certain times of the year imagery and look really hard. And he also told us, get down low, stay down around 1,000 to 2,000 feet under eye altitude. So we did that. I'm going to zoom back out. Now, some of these are really amazing, by the way. I won't take time to show any more, but they're really pretty incredible the more you look at them. And I didn't zoom in on one of the best of them all. There are some great ones, and he has 100 of them or something like that, 150 some. So we started looking, and we were all very excited about this. And sure enough, we found them within 24 hours, just in our office using Google Earth. After all those years of field work, trying to figure out whether this landscape had permafrost.
Including right near Carlisle.
Including right near here. So, and look at where they are. Let me turn off my borders and labels for a minute and go to my upright view here. They go from north to south. We don't have as many below this one right in here, 53, until we get down to 54. They're harder and harder to find. But we certainly have quite a belt of them that is equivalent in extent to that in the coastal plain. Now, George Gow's are in coastal plain sediments. Ours are in bedrock. And the only limitation here is time. I could keep mapping them. If I had a student to do just this, I could map these probably for 2 or 3 months easily and just keep finding more sites. But let me go show you some of them just to show you how spectacular they are. And again, some of them are way better than others, but let's try up here. Let's see, I'm gonna go try number 11 and see what I have there, where that takes me. Is not one of my best, but you can kind of see it there. I'm trying to remember which one I want to go here. I want to get near Enola. Let's see. So Noel, maybe you can help me get to Enola here.
Enola, it's down in the Great Valley.
Too far.
Yeah, go south a little more.
Oh, down there it is.
There you
Probably
go,
there we
way
go.
down toward the bottom.
Right here. Okay,
Down
thank
low.
you. Yeah, I was way north there. I didn't realize I was zoomed in so much. All right, so let's go in here and look at some of these. This is just south of Blue Mountain, north of
Up toward
Carlisle,
Waggoner's Gap.
up by Waggoner's Gap. And sure enough, there they are. And we'll look at some more nearby in a moment here. And we're looking at a September view. Let's try this one over here. Yeah, they're really amazing, actually. The more you look at them, and the lighting in here is not ideal right now, but
Ah, good.
yeah, quite nice. There's no doubt that these things are thermal contraction polygons. So we've now mapped them, and we now know, oh, thank you. And then we saw these weird things nearby the thermal contraction polygons, these things. These dark, I call them silt-filled swales, because we've dug into them and trenched into them, and they're just silt. probably loess, windblown silt. Now watch this. If I go to another time of the year, you don't see them. You don't see the thermal contraction polygons, and you don't see that silt-filled swale. This is a very gentle swale. There's hardly any relief to it. And yet there's this dark area down there showing up in great contrast, because the silt at that time of the year was moist. It was holding moisture, and it showed up. The archaeologists refer to them as crop marks, but it shows up as something dark because it's moist. And along the polygon boundaries, they're showing up as dark because the sandy, silty material in them is moist. So that's why we're seeing those. So I wondered, well, what are these things that look kind of like stream networks, right? But they're not. If you walk out there, you can barely tell they exist. There's so little relief. They're just slightly low, these spots. So I began to wonder about them. And let me go forward for a minute, or in my PowerPoint here. How much
You
time?
have to switch your share.
Oh, because they're not seeing it then?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, new share. So I'm now going back to the PowerPoint for good. So, and PowerPoint is going to be here. All right. So I'll come back to these things. I'll come back to these in a moment. Let me go to thermal contraction polygons here near the end of since I went to Google Earth, I want to stick with this topic for a minute. So there's that site that I just showed you. There's that silt-filled swale. And I've exaggerated topography in Google Earth. I've stretched it out vertically to try to show the relief. It's actually very subtle, especially on the side slopes. I began to wonder what these things might be. And then I found out that in Antarctica, people are working on things like that. So the left view is Antarctica. And a person named Joe Levy in particular is working on these. He's at Colgate. And others are working on them now. They become very prominent in Arctic studies because they're called water tracks, and they're associated with permafrost thaw. So when the ground is frozen, and you can see in the lower left there, the cracked ground in Antarctica has polygons, thermal contraction polygons. They're all over the hilltops here. And then out here where the snow patches are, right below the snow patches, the permafrost is exposed. The permafrost table is exposed. It's thawing. Moisture is coming out, almost like groundwater seeps. It's a type of sapping. And that moisture is flowing down slope. And they call these water tracks. And these water tracks are really special places in Antarctica and elsewhere because they're wet and they're ideal for habitat. The rest of the landscape is frozen and barren and dusty and dry. And here are these nice wet places with very slowly flowing water. So they're not formed the way gullies are formed on a farm field if some farmer is using poor farming practices and the land is getting eroded and you get this steep gully. It's not like that. These are wide and shallow, and the ground under them is frozen. That's why they're wide and shallow. And just a little bit of moisture is flowing off and removing some silty material and washing it down slope to accumulate to fill the valley bottom down below with silt. There might never have been, in our case, for the upper or the right there, that's the Enola area below Blue Mountain, might never have been much water flowing in that valley. It's a swale. That's why I call it a silt-filled swale. But some water flowed over time during times of permafrost thaw and gradually lowered that landscape. And you can notice the water tracks are interconnected with the boundaries of thermal contraction polygons. And if you wonder about the reason, it's because the rock is fractured. And all the polygon boundaries are along fracture boundaries, and all the silt coming out of those is moving down along fracture boundaries. And that's where much of the thaw is occurring, and that's where much of the groundwater then begins to emanate eventually. Because even the groundwater at the top of the groundwater table was cut off during really cold times. So that became very interesting to us when we thought, well, since these are thermal contraction polygons down the lower right, we should be able to drive along the roads and find one exposed, like the boundary of one. The boundaries of these are sand-filled wedges, we think. They're showing up dark on our air photos. So we drove along, we had our iPad with us, and we were looking on the iPad at where we were looking at these Google Earth images, and there I saw it on the left, right along that Enola Road. And the interesting thing is, I went back recently, like a week ago, and you can't see it at all. The whole thing is collapsed. But that day I saw it. And we did get over there and scrape it all clean. It's Martinsburg shale, the bedrock. It's highly fractured. And the reason it's highly fractured is because it had permafrost. And it had that frost cracking that Joe Marshall has modeled. So it's intensely shattered rock. It's called ice brecciated, in fact. And it has some pre-existing joints from tectonic activity over the many, many hundreds of millions of years. It has some fabric from the bedding in the rock, but there's this near vertical thing cut into it. It actually followed a pre-existing joint plane in the bedrock. It opened up with time and filled in with sand. We sampled that sand. You can see it on the upper right in that scanning electron microscope image. It's rounded sand. It's not from the shale bedrock. It blew in, and we did grain size analysis on this sand, silty sand. And we got 2 days using something called OSL, optically stimulated luminescence dating. We found out it's 15 to 16,000 years old. That means the ground was cracking and opening 15 to 16,000 years ago, and sand was blowing in. At that time, it would have looked like that landscape in the lower left. Go ahead, Noel.
I'd like to emphasize that those polygons, Dorothy just said 16,000 years ago. Those polygons are left over from that long ago and not too high tech. I mean, it was high tech for Google Earth to make Google Earth, but once it's available to everybody, anybody in theory could go and find these things if they have to get up and go to do it. And it's remarkable that you could find something left over from that long ago. And it's still there.
And they are paleothermometers. If you find them, if you can use enough reasoning to indicate they must have been forming 16,000 years ago, you know what the temperature was at that time, and you know there was permafrost here at that time. So it's really powerful for us. So we've now mapped these all over the region. There's the ice margin to the north, and all the white dots are those polygons. We've also found out where the gray ones in the east are the coastal plain ones from George Gow. We've scoured the literature for any indication of anyone finding anything like this. We have not yet found of anyone saying they saw these in this region, as far as I know, but we have found evidence people saw wedges, sand wedges, and what they thought might be ice wedge casts. And we indicate those here, so they're little triangles. And we're able to show now that this region had permafrost, going south to that last southernmost dot in white on the left and in gray on the right. The black is shale. We only find these in shale. We don't find them in sandstone, we think, because all the sandstone has formed hills and ridges where there was a lot of Jello Flexion and colluvium that would have buried anything like that. There was plenty of frost cracking going on and probably thermal contraction cracking, but it's not going to leave a record we can see. So limestone, I think, would have them. And people have found sand wedges in limestone, but I can't find it in the aerial imagery. I've tried and I have not yet found them.
Is the landscape lowered in, say, 10,000 years from solution of the limestone? Is it enough to obliterate?
I wonder, something about the soil, something's different. We just don't see them yet, at least. So let me get back and finish up then. So now we can get back and say, all right, we know then that there was permafrost. So then we come back to this question, well, these lobes that we see in the region, were they associated with permafrost? They're pretty spectacular, right? And we got lucky. 2 years ago, we were driving around looking, my students and I, looking for places where we could see inside the lobes to try to do cosmogenic dating of a lobe. And I wanted a lobe that was young looking. There's plenty of lobes in the landscape, but I wanted one that was young. And we saw from a distance from the Blue Mountain Ski Resort over by heading northeast towards Palmerton, we saw this road cut to the north. And I actually told my students, I'm so excited, I'm going to lie down and kiss the ground. And I did, because this is what I needed. Now, the upper view there is more recent than what I saw because they had paved the road by that time. When I saw it, they had just finished digging out the road. It was all fresh exposures. Notice on the right, a boulder field, kind of like the one at Hickory Run, except much steeper, but it is a boulder field. It looks very similar. And you can see a huge road cut to the left of the boulder field. I don't have an image in here of this, but we have thousands of images, including from drones. And when you stand there right here at the edge, and you can see the boulder field through the trees, in here where you stand, there's a bench here. You can see the entire exposure of stratigraphy. which is amazing. We have a 3D view essentially of that boulder field. We can look inside it, we can look at the top of it. So we ran up and down this slope. We got permission to be there for this. They put up an AT&T cell tower eventually. And along these exposures, we tried to map everything. And right here, in this hump, we were certain we were looking at, and that's this down below, we were looking at a very recent deposit of lobe-like material, probably associated with Jello Flexion. And on the right is shown hill slope diagrams. Down there is a slope, and above it is stuff that would move by Jello Flexion. And that's called a velocity profile. Everything's moving at about the same velocity. They move slowly. They only move maybe a meter a year during thaw. But you can imagine that stuff moving down slope. It would have come from up here, which is now tree covered, but back then it wasn't. It would have come down this slope from bedrock. And in fact, right above it in the zigzag of the road is exposed shattered bedrock, highly shattered bedrock, incredibly shattered, so shattered, it looks like the sandstone bedrock, except if you could walk up and pull a boulder out. In fact, you could, they fall out. So we sampled this thing top to bottom for cosmogenic dating. We flew the drone over it over and over and made these 3D models. So what you see here in the middle in B is actually not a photo, it's a 3-dimensional model, a point cloud from drone photogrammetry, making a point cloud, just kind of like a LiDAR point cloud, we make it from the imagery. And on the right is one for the road cut, oops, right above it. And what it says C is the road cut above it where there's shattered bedrock. And then down below is the boulder field. And using this image, this data, this point cloud data, we could do grain size analysis using a technique Julia Carr developed at Penn State. So down the lower right is the grain size analysis for the boulder field in yellow, way over there. And then in the middle, these are a bunch of Jello Flexion lobes on that road cut. The left, far left over there is I think that's the sand from our sand wedge at the Enola thermal contraction polygon wedge. So there's us using a grid over that entire outcrop to try to measure all the boulders and get grain size and this defined sediment too. And then I'm going to skip this for now. And I think I'm almost out of time. So let me go right to this, the last one here then. From top to bottom, we sampled the matrix of this material. It is matrix supported, like we'd expect for Jello Flexion or Jello Flexion. And we sampled some of the clasts, the boulders themselves. And then my students went up to University of Vermont and they crushed and they sieved and they extracted aliquots for beryllium and aluminum analyses for beryllium 10, aluminum 26 isotopes. That was all then sent up to Purdue, Prime Lab, and then COVID hit. So the lab was shut down. But eventually they opened up back up again, ran our samples, sent us the results almost a year ago now. So we've had this data for almost a year. We've been working through it. But what it tells us essentially is these boulders and this matrix have not been exposed very long. In fact, probably no more than 20,000 years. So that means they were produced, and they were produced by cracking, exposed to cosmic ray flux, and then they moved and got buried in that outcrop. But all of that happened, let me go back to this view, all of it happened recently during last glacial maximum. And it makes sense given the context. Upslope is frost shattered rock. Downslope is an outcrop of material that moved downslope from that frost shattered rock. And we're on a fairly steep slope here. We can see the stratigraphy of this. We know it's an earth flow type deposit, in fact, multiple deposits. So active layer after active layer thaw, one layer after another piled up on top. So the lobe shape is many deposits, has a lobe form, but it's many deposits of strata. So we now know there's permafrost. And we think that probably most of the lobes we're seeing were associated with permafrost, because how else do you get so much sediment piled up? And in fact, the farther south we go, the less able we are to see these kinds of things. If you go down to the Carolinas, we don't see these types of deposits. That's nothing like them. And we don't see thermal contraction polygons. So our landscape is very different here. All right, thank you. Have time for questions?
Yeah,
All
absolutely.
right. Maybe lights in. Thanks.
Yeah, and if you stop your share, we could actually people will be able to
See the
you.
audience
Yeah.
then and see me, okay?
You step
Do
out.
that.
AI?
Yeah, let me get one student first and then come to you, Noel.
Good,
So I saw you had your
good.
hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming. It's so like, you're so articulate and so well listening.
Well, thanks. It's always nice to hear because one doesn't know, right?
I was wondering just, so you said it's really helpful to know the paleo temperatures of that area. And I was wondering what that would inform of knowing the weather temperatures. What else would that inform you about?
Good question. I even thought about it as I was telling you all that. I thought, why would I tell them that we need to know that? If we know the temperatures at that time, let's see, so we would then be able to say, at a time when we're finding pollen that tells us there were certain types of plants, that this was the temperature at those times. At a time when we're finding maybe the migration of a certain type of animal into an area, this was the temperature at that time. And then we know how much colder it was then compared to now. And we can say, well, it was actually cold enough. It was this cold. And it's now this much warmer. And in that 20,000 year period, all of these plant types, that's where I was going to go next, and I won't bother to, but in the next image I had, there was a scientist in the 1960s saying, I think there was tundra here, based on the seeds I'm finding. And if there were tundra plants, there must have been maybe solar flexion going on, the hill slopes, and maybe frost cracking and all these things. So, but now we can piece that all together and say, yes, the plant record, the fossil record, the landscape record, we're getting a landscape record. And until this work, there was no way to use landforms and deposits to get temperature. All the pollen people have been doing it for decades, and they're very lucky, and they've been able to tell us, well, I know there were tundra plants, here's how cold it probably was. But we don't always have pollen. And in fact, it's very hard to find pollen. Noel and Helen have worked hard to get pollen data from various sites. But you have to core and on, and then get all these things. So we can do it now just using LiDAR. And Google Earth. We could do it all the way across North America. We could actually go west beyond the eastern US and start saying, well, look what I see. Now, we don't always know the timing of these things. That's challenging. I had to go date them. That would be the next step. I wonder if Noel or anyone else has any thoughts about that question. It's a good question. Why does it matter?
Well, I was going to say, you hit lots of it, but I was going to remind people that with these changes of permafrost and other things, there were tremendous vegetation changes.
Yeah.
We think of South Mountain today, or North Mountain as trees, but there weren't even colder temperature trees. It was probably,
Like Antarctica.
we know it was tundra because of a core taken right down near King's Gap.
So we have a question from
Go ahead.
Andy per second.
Go ahead,
right.
Andy. Is it Andy?
Morning.
Andy.
Yeah, thanks for that great
Go ahead,
talk. That was,
Andy
that was
Cookie.
yeah, that's, this is, oh, sorry, I could turn on my video if you can see it. I didn't.
Oh,
think of that.
it's actually,
Hold on. it'll
We're
get
getting the
there.
volume up.
because it's running from there.
Can you hear me
So
now?
let's go back to PC.
Ah, there we are.
Almost,
we gotta
Andy.
go
We
back
can't quite hear
to
you yet, but we're
PC.
getting there.
How about that now?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
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 Morning. Thank you for the talk. It was really good. I was just curious that with one of the pictures you showed of the ice wedge cross section that you found in the exposure, it seemed like it was quite a bit smaller than some of the room size ice wedge polygons that you were showing on Google Earth. Maybe it was just that I couldn't get a sense for the scale, but is there something significant about that wedge size, and can you tell something about the paleo temperature from that wedge size and geometry?
Yeah. Can you see me actually right now? Can you see me with my
You have
hands
to
waving?
Step out. a little.
I cannot. I can, if you stand in front of the whiteboard. There you are. Yeah.
Okay. So the polygon would be like the walls of the room. And down along the walls, imagine the room is just cracked open, like all the walls are cracked. They're near vertical cracks. And they're open maybe a millimeter or two, a little bit of sand gets in there. And then they close back up again during the warm season. And the cold season comes, they all open a little bit, sand gets in there. That keeps happening year after year, and so then they fill with sand, depending on the sand flux and how long the cracks open. But the cracks open in the cold time. So imagine all the walls now are a little bit wider and they're filled with sand. And what we did then was we drove along and we kind of sliced into one of those boundaries and we looked at the wedge width. And you're right, it's not very wide. So it might be telling us that it didn't crack open very many times. It wasn't enough time to get a lot of sand in there. It is fairly deep though. But I think you're right that if it had been happening for a prolonged time, let's say 10,000 years, it might be an even wider wedge. But if you can trace that wedge, it goes, if we went into that outcrop, it's near perpendicular to the outcrop. We'd be going along the boundary of a wedge, and that whole boundary is filled with sand. So the polygons are big, but the wedges are skinny. They're just the edges of the polygons.
I see. So just a brief follow-up to that. Do you think that wedge was ever filled with ice, or was that only a sediment-filled wedge?
Yeah, to answer that, I'm gonna have to keep in mind that if all the permafrost experts were in the room, they'd be ready to jump on me as I speak here. They would say to me, you can't be sure that there's no ice in there, and there's little subtle hints that maybe there was some ice and certainly some sand. Maybe you know a lot about this, but so these are kind of slushy. And so that means there's some moisture maybe, but not enough moisture to make it all an ice wedge. An ice wedge is nearly 100% ice typically. And they can get really big because they keep accumulating water and ice with time and growing wider and wider. Some are quite wide. We didn't have those conditions, but there might have been some water. There's things about the sediment in that crack that indicate there might have been some ice.
Cool. Thank you very much.
In the, at that same outcrop, follow up with Andy on the Martinsburg, there's been a lot of work done over the years looking at cleavage within the Martinsburg formation. And if you're this ice breccia, I would assume that the orientations would be all over the map. And if I were to start measuring cleavage surfaces, why do I find preferred orientations and well-developed cleavage sets?
Yeah. So the two things are going on there. One is that frost shattering has a limited depth, might only be a meter, in fact. In fact, it's about the same depth as the wedges are. If you're getting road cuts or quarries that are showing below that depth, you're looking at unaltered. Even though there's permafrost down there, the zone of shattering tends to be near the surface where it freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, and there's more moisture available. But at depth, it's just frozen ground. But the second thing is a lot of that shattered material moved down slope during thaw, even with shale.
Yeah.
And that's what Tom Gardner worked
Yeah.
on at that. Tom Gardner, one of his professors at Penn State, did this amazing study in the 1990s. I think they did it throughout the 80s and published in the 90s of a big quarry in shale, and they're down slope near the base of the slope. And the entire quarry is pieces of shale that move down slope. And in those pieces of shale colluvium are wedges, sand wedges. And within the sand wedges are pieces of shale. They're amazing features. And he understood then that this probably had to do with permafrost. And he doesn't focus on that idea, but he understood it. He recognized it clearly that the stuff must have moved down slope during thaw. In fact, he saw like cycles of deposits from coarser or finer that he associated with almost like graded bedding in streams. It was being moved down slope during thaw, and then it would be cold again and frozen, and move down slope during thaw, then cold again. So that's why I think we're not seeing it. Anything that was shattered tended to flow off the slope during thaw, and quarries and road cuts were down below the crack zone.
So I believe Helen would like to ask a question.
Yes, Helen.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. I couldn't hear the earlier question, but I think it was about why does it matter if we know the dates? And the reason comes to my mind is that if we have better dates on all of these things, it's much easier to talk about whether or not these changing climate events are happening synchronously across the globe or across the continent or across a smaller area, and making the distinction between the Pleistocene and early Holocene climate changes and modern climate change is fairly important if we're going to get at causes.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, we need timing of things. We don't need to know the ages. We need to know how cold it was, and we need to know where these things exist, like if we map them out spatially. And if it's the student's question you're asking about, she was wondering, how does it help us to know the temperature at that time? What
Okay.
was the
Yeah,
temperature?
I couldn't hear the actual question, but from the answers, I thought it was there. But again, the same thing is pretty much relevant if you're looking at changes through time and across wide areas, knowing whether or not things are synchronous, and if you've got precise temperatures, that gives you a zonation and so forth. So
It's a good analog for modern permafrost thaw. We can say, hey, in 20,000 years, it'll be forested.
right. So, anyhow, that was it.
Are there any other questions on Zoom or here? If not, why don't we, Ben.
I can ask you afterwards, that's fine. Do you do?
No, we have time.
Was I just thinking back to the shattering and doing a little bit of soil work between the Martinsburg and, for example, the limestones? One of the big differences immediately is there's almost no soil even now on the shales.
Right.
And so if you go to the limestone at the farm, there are places where there's 4 meters of soil, probably much less likely to see these features in a clay-rich soil, maybe.
I think you're right.
Shale with really shallow soils.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. And the shale has some slopes, so stuff has moved down slope, which has actually removed maybe much of the active layer, the last version of the active layer, and we can see the shattered bedrock below. Whereas limestone has all this clay on top of it and was down to low valley bottoms, wetlands, and on. Is your hand up, sir?
I think they will just, but yes.
Jordan?
Jordan? Is she on?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to follow up on that a bit. And I was really struck by what you were saying with, where you can observe these features relative to the bedrock type. And I'm wondering if that's true in modern analogs, like in current permafrost regions. Have they done any kind of work looking at bedrock and the preservation of these features?
That's a fantastic question. And, I've reached out to all these permafrost experts over the last few years, and I've begun working with some of them and corresponding with some of them. And they tell me that there's almost no work on thermal contraction polygons in bedrock. It's almost always in sediment. They're very well formed in sediments, like in coastal plain environments in Alaska, for example. But it's really hard to find literature on thermal contraction polygons in bedrock. So for me, now there is literature on frost cracking, which is different than thermal contraction cracking. The frost cracking, which with ice aggregation lenses, there's a lot of work on that in bedrock in Europe. But that's a great question, Jordan. If somebody could do that, even using Google Earth, probably, right? But also, anywhere it's wetter, we're not going to probably find something quite like this. We need these sand wedges to really see these features in Google Earth.
That's so interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, let's talk more about these ideas. I think geophysics could play a role here.
I think so too. I think we could have a lot of conversations. Maybe loop Andy in too.
Right.
Did you mention that you had LiDAR image of the Jello Flexion?
Yes. May I show you this?
Yeah.
So-
I would love to see that.
Wait do you see? I have something to show all of you that I was saving for last. I need to get back to my screen. How do I do that?
Let's go back to, switch back to
Yeah, wait do
you.
you see what I have now? I'm going to do a new screen share once I have my,
Yeah,
I guess
so it's not this.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So give me a moment here. And we're going to get out of my email. I want to be over here.
And you need to share your screen too.
Okay, good. Let me get over there and then I'll share it then. Go to this one, I think. Yes, okay. So I'm going to share my screen and then you'll see this. So I'm working with Mike Ronis. He has helped us to create something in Mapbox, which allows us to zoom into the landscape. See if I can remember the command keys. There are different command keys here to use for this. And we can see Jello Flexion on the slopes, and anybody can do this. We're going to be releasing all this through a link that anybody can use. And you can then, if I can remember how to do this. I don't remember what my command keys are here. It's been a few months since we're still developing this, but you could tilt the landscape like we do in Google Earth. And you can see all these lobes. This is in central PA near State College. So do you see them? Or actually, maybe I'm up near Dwaynefield area now. What's the name of that quad? Nesquehoning quad up in the coal country. So this is one of them. This is the Nesquehoning area up in northeastern Pennsylvania. You see all the lobes on there. And as I said, you'll be able to tilt. We're going to have I'm going to make a narrated tour. We're still developing this. I'll make a narrated tour. And then so you can see lots of lobes right over here. You can fly down around them like you're in a plane. And then I have some from central PA, which must be down here, I guess.
What are the red outlines?
They're bedrock. We've mapped in there. Can somebody read for me way down there? I don't have it on my screen. What's red down there? Oh, there's,
Thermal contraction.
and then the red polygons are, might not be here. I think we were mapping different rock types. So green is sandstone. And now you can see under the sandstone, all those lobes. What it's showing us is, oh, I know, the red is rubble. It's been mapped by soil scientists. We're actually including soils data here. All around State College area, the Ridge and Valley, they've mapped in, everything in red there is what they mapped as rubble, and everything in green they mapped as something like colluvial soils. So
Do you have any LiDAR from your Wagoner's Gap? Can you pull that up?
I do, yep, I have that too.
Because there's some lovely.
I do,
ones
yep.
there.
So I'll share that screen in a moment here. Give me a moment and I'll share that. So everybody online, you'll see this in just a moment here. Okay, new share.
Yeah, there you
To
go. Can
this?
you zoom in on that?
Yeah. So that's up here, I think. Is that the right window? Can you all see an image that shows a little circles in the lower right that are blue and red for those online?
Yep, we got them.
Okay, thank you. And you're going to see in a moment, I'm going to zoom into that view in a moment here. Okay, that's Waggoner's Gap area or somewhere near there. Yeah, it says Waggoner's Gap.
Yeah, yeah.
Blue Mountain at the top. And then that top would be that zone of rubble. It's all kind of fractured, shattered rock. And coming down slope, we get to this area where we have, this is a slope shade. So we have all these lobes and we've mapped them out with blue lines. We've measured them and we've counted them and given, we pick a square area or a rectangular area and we count them. As we go from north to south, there are fewer of them. So that blue histogram on the right is going north to south. The top left, the left of that blue histogram is the glacial margin, the Laurentide ice sheet margin. And you can see as we get down here, which would be towards Maryland, we can't find as many lobes on LiDAR data. And there are fewer records of people finding colluvium in their mapping. And we can't find any more thermal contraction polygons. So I'm making the argument that these are somehow both telling us about permafrost and active layer thaw, the Jello Flexion and the thermal contraction polygons. You wouldn't get all the Jello Flexion if you didn't have lots of frost cracking and active layer thaw.
So as you drive along, I guess it's 74 up to Waggoner's Gap, if you look to the north, there's a break in the, there's some really steep slope where the bedrock is, to a break in slope where you get onto that colluvial wedge with all the Jello Flexion lobes. That colluvial wedge, always, the leaves always stay on the trees a little bit later. Is that because there's more fines to hold the moisture? So you're seeing that, and it's all along Blue Mountain there. As you look both ways, you see this abrupt boundary at this time of year, where above a certain point, there's no leaves, and below it, it's almost as if it's 2 weeks behind.
Yes, it's definitely moisture because it's, I think, permeable porous. There's a lot of sandy matrix. It's really sandy. We've done grain size on this colluvium and other colluvium. And downslope, you can see where these buried valleys are emerging. These are actually the former valleys that were there prior to the onset of all the glaciation and periglaciation. So the valleys have been filled in, and you're just getting downslope far enough to start seeing them. Well, under all that colluvium is water flowing.
Yep.
Along
If you
bedrock
go
fractures.
down- If you go down into the bottom of those little valleys, they're shale. And then,
Yeah.
The Martinsburg goes a fair bit up underneath,
Yeah, I think the Martinsburg starts up in here, doesn't it?
I think.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you everyone who tuned in remotely, and thank you everyone who came.
Thank you.
Dorothy, a little memento to bring back.
Oh, cool. I love this. See if you can see it, or they
Oh, the
gone?
camera's up there.
Oh,
but
okay.
Yeah.
What's it saying?
It says Dickinson College Earth Sciences, and it's red on the inside, nice.
Did somebody give her a poster?
Oh, yeah, can I have a poster
Yes,
too?
we have plenty of those for you.
Yeah, I saw them all over the place. Thanks, everyone. It's fun getting to talk with you. Hey, go map polygons on Google Earth, okay? Thank
You want
you.
more?
Sure, I'll take two. I can
Okay.
keep one for myself and give the department one.
Yeah.
I gotta go. but
All right.
Thank you for
Welcome.
coming.
You're welcome.
We'll see you again someday.
Very Potteresque, right?
Huh?
Very Potteresque talk.
Very good.